So I'll talk a bit about Buddhist history. This is kind of an addendum video with my YouTube video on the subject, since some parts maybe weren't complete. Since it's a big long subject, I talk for 2 hours. I'll just give you some hits. But this is perhaps
Buddhist greatest hits.
Well, this is actually this Pali scholar who emailed me actually watched my YouTube video called What is Wrong with Buddhism. He said, Brian, how can you joke around about something that you're dead serious about? So I'm going to try as much as my best not to joke around here and just be straight. Because this is perhaps the biggest taboo in the entire religion. This is something that's not really discussed, that the Mahayana was not taught by the Buddha. The Theravada is regarded by scholars, without much debate about this, as the authentic, true teachings of the Buddha. So most Theravadins are polite and they don't discuss this outside of their own company. So I was in some of these circles where they discuss this, and I've been picking this up for the last 20 years. And I was a Tibetan Buddhist in 1991, and I converted around 1993 when I found out this particular information I can tell you now. So I'd like to save you many years of confusion. In fact, some people on YouTube have emailed Brian, you save me so much time from going through so many dead ends, these comments on YouTube. Really appreciate explaining the history. Other people on YouTube said this is the best history lesson on Buddhism I've ever seen anywhere on YouTube. There's probably not a lot of them. So anyways, having built this up, so I'll describe where does Buddhism come from. So the first 5 centuries particularly, there were some serious splits, like most religions, right? Most divide and split over views, and Buddhism's the same. However, I'll preface my statements by saying there's never been any history of religious war in Buddhist history. That's good. We'll start with the Buddha's death. The calendar, I should know the year today, something like 2,570, 80, something or whatever. And the Buddhist calendar basically goes from when they think the Buddha died. So that's called Buddhist era. So 0 BE, this is when the Buddha died. So that's really the beginning of the calendar, not at his birth or not his enlightenment, but when he dies. So he died at the age of 80, 0 BE. So the history at that point was everything was fine. The Buddha felt he could go. He was ready to go because his teachings were in place. So after his death, the 500 enlightened arahants, these are fully enlightened monks and nuns, they decided to convene the first council. This was held 3 months after the Buddha's passing, for the purpose of ratifying the Buddha's teachings, agreeing upon what he taught, and also leaving out some repetitive teachings that weren't necessary. That they agreed upon 84,000 lines, which is like 6,000 pages. They felt that was enough to preserve. So everybody was in agreement, everything was fine, and things went on smoothly for a century, and Buddhism spread. Here's my map of India here. So pretty much just in northeastern India. So in the first century, started to spread out. So these were the golden days, the good old days of Buddhism. Thousands of enlightened arahants. Things were fine. And then there was a schism, which occurred about 100 years after the Buddha. I would describe this as a minor schism. I don't know the whole story. I think the scholars themselves don't quite understand it. It seems the problem is one side wanted to introduce more rules, because they have these 227 precepts for monks, plus hundreds of lesser rules. So one side said, well, we should be really good and disciplined and virtuous and add more rules. And the other side said, look, we got enough rules. We're virtuous enough. We don't need any more rules. And it seems scholars have different views. They don't seem to know for sure which side was which. So originally there was no sects. It was just the Dhamma, right? The Buddhist teachings of Dhamma. And you could call them the Theras. So Thera is a term, basically just means elders. The elders who carried on after the Buddha, senior monks. So that was fine. So then once they had the schism, they had to distinguish themselves, the Theras, from the other guys. So the other group were called the Mahasangikas. They called themselves that, which is this term here. So Maha is a term basically means higher. Like Mahayana, they call themselves a higher wheel, big wheel. Yana means vehicle or wheel. So Sangika means, Sangha means community, community amongst the nuns. So they call themselves the great community. Okay, so that was the first schism, but it wasn't really a big deal. Apparently, they didn't change the Buddha's teachings about some rules. But the really big schism was 137 years after the Buddha. Some translations or texts say it was 116 years. It seems most scholars favor 137 years after the Buddha. It doesn't really matter. We're dealing with ancient history here. But it's important to point that we do really know basically what happened every century. I knew Professor A.K. Warder in Toronto. He was the head of Buddhist studies at the University of Toronto. I met with him. And he wrote quite a well-known, quite reputable book called Indian Buddhism back in the 60s. You know, with all these schools of thought and all the splits. So it's very thoroughly studied. Just so you know, it's not like, oh, it's a big mystery. It's not that. It's just very complicated if you want to read it. So what happened 137 years after the Buddha? Well, there was a schism led by Mahadeva. He's kind of the big bad guy in early Buddhist history. So Mahadeva was a monk who he sort of tapped into the sediment within the Buddhist world. Some people didn't get along with the leadership, which is the arahants. Because the Buddha said, you know, after I die, you know, the arahants, the fully enlightened ones, they're obviously the leaders of the community. Well, just like in normal human politics, right? Some people don't like the leaders telling them that they're smarter than you. So some people, you know, he tapped into the sediment. So he led a revolt against the arahants. In fact, one of the early sects at that time, the Samidya sect, they claimed that Mahadeva was the incarnation of Mara himself. So Mara is like the Buddhist Satan or the devil. He's a deva, heavenly being, lives in the 6th heaven. So Mara is the one that's trying to tempt you, basically prevent people from getting enlightened. According to the Samidya sect, which was witnesses at the time, they were there. They said Mara took form, human form, which is possible according to Buddhist teachings. He donned the robes of a monk, and he led the schism. Do I believe that? I don't know. There's other accounts.
Did he do anything else, like kill anybody? Or?
Not that I'm aware of, no.
No? Okay.
No, I wouldn't say so, no. No, I wouldn't say he did that. But what he did, he tapped in the sediment, and he was a charismatic speaker. He led a revolt against the monks, and he had a debate with the arahants. His revolt was against the arahants, the enlightened ones. He said, they're not really enlightened. They're not good enough. We shouldn't follow them. And I'll tell you why. He said he proposes his 5 theses, famous 5 theses, I mean 5 things, he said, which are wrong with arahants. First, he said, they're prone to having seminal emissions in their sleep, which is sperm. So Mahadeva, I don't believe that he checked the sheets of the monks to see if there was sperm in the sheets. But this is his which we in the Theravada school regard as a ludicrous kind of accusation to make. However, just to explain Mahadeva's statement, the Buddha did discuss this. The Buddha said, you know, if a monk has seminal emissions in his sleep, then this is not an offense. It's not a problem. Of course, if a monk has seminal emissions, you know, deliberately, then that's a sangha desess. It's not a disrobing offense, but it's close to that. You've got to do a penance. But if it's in your sleep, the Buddha said, no, that's the way it is. It's okay, so it's not an offense. But Mahadeva's point was, well, these guys are arahants, right? They're fully enlightened. They're having seminal emissions in their sleep. Therefore, he concluded, this means that they're prone to the effects of demonic spirits. Therefore, they can't really be enlightened.
That's reason enough for a schism.
That's a schism. So the second reason, he said, some of these arahants are prone to having nightmares, which again indicates that they're prone to the effects of demonic spirits, so therefore they can't be enlightened. And the other ones, he said, so that was 2. The other faults, he said, they're still subject to having doubts. They have doubts. They're fully enlightened. They've got doubts. Also, they're still ignorant of many things, and they're supposed to be enlightened. and also they have to rely upon others for their salvation. So in these 5 counts, the arhants are no good, so let's leave. Come on, guys, let's quit. So then he let thousands of people off. So this was like a sub-schism within the Mahasangikas. So the Mahasangikas already existed a few decades. So within the Mahasangikas, the Mahasangikas themselves split into 7 different schools of the Mahasangikas. So Mahadeva, he did the big split. So this is quite serious because, of course, getting back to the Buddha, the arhants are the leadership. So once you turn your back on the arhants, the actual leaders, the enlightened beings, then what the Mahasangikas are doing is they're just sort of going through a forest without a trail. They're just getting lost. Where are they going? They're not following the enlightened leadership. They're paving their own path. So this has led to the problems that we have in Buddhism today and the schisms of different traditions today. One of the important decisions they made too was that they didn't regard the Pali Sutras of the Buddha as the final last word. So the Pali Sutras, the actual discourse of the Buddha, Theravadins believe is the highest authority in the religion. I mean, apparently, obviously to us, the Buddha's words, like this right here, and all the other sutras, this is the highest authority in the religion. But we are the only school in Buddhism today that has that view. No other school in Buddhism has that view. So they were the first to open the door to the possibility, well, maybe the Buddha's inspiration could come to us in other ways. Maybe the Buddha could like manifest like a second coming. But the Buddha said that after he died, he said, I will not be seen by gods and men. So we made it clear, there'll be no visitations of the Buddha. No one's ever going to see the Buddha again. He's gone. That's clear from the Theravada view. The Mahayana says, well, who knows? And maybe the Buddha's teachings can channel down from the Devas, because the Buddha taught the heavenly beings, And this is actually true. The Buddha taught the Devas heavenly beings, and it's actually true that Devas could channel down to human beings. That itself is not an issue. So that's what happened with the Mahayana. So then they carried on for a few centuries, maybe 2 or 3 centuries during that time. They divided eventually into 7 schools, 7 different schools of Mahayana. But the Theras, they divided into 11 different schools. Like there's a Samidiya sect in northern India and others, and the Savastivardhans, various schools. They're all very similar, and they all have the same Pali Sutras, no argument about the Buddha's discourses. And originally with the Mahayana, they didn't change the Buddha's discourses. They didn't tamper with that. So they saw the Pali Sutras. So then you had all these various schools. And then what happened next? What was the next big thing? The next big thing was, 50 BC was the rise of the Mahayana. So this occurred within several of the schools of the Mahasangikas. Several of the people got together, monks, nuns, lay people, and they announced that we have a new vehicle of the Buddhist teachings called the Mahayana, which is it's described as the big wheel. And the Buddhist teachings compared to an 8-fold path. Here's your 8 folds. Then they announced about 50 BC. Well, now we have a higher wheel of the Buddhist teachings called the Mahayana. This is something new. I think this is about 400 years after the Buddha. Some books say 500 years. Of course, the Theravadins and the similar schools, and even the Mahayana said, well, where'd you get that? I mean, we haven't seen this in the last 400 years. We haven't seen these higher teachings of Buddha. We doubt the authenticity of your teachings there in the Mahayana. Where'd it come from? And so what they explain, and you can get this from, most of Mahayana centers in the world, they'll explain that, well, the Buddha in his lifetime on earth, he taught the Mahayana teachings, which are higher teachings. And he didn't give them to human beings generally at that time because he gave the Hinayana, the lower teachings called Hinayana. This is a term here, lesser Hinayana. And the Hinayana, they say, was teachings the Buddha gave for people with blunt faculties who couldn't get the higher teachings. because they had blunt faculties. This is what's stated in the Mahayana scriptures. So they say that the Buddha in his lifetime on earth, he taught the Mahayana to the devas, the heavenly beings. I should describe the term deva. This is a term for an angel. And then around 50 BC, these Mahayana teachings were channeled down from the devas to Nagarjuna, who was a saint who lived in India. And the Mahayanas kind of adopted him as a Mahayana saint, although Nagarjuna himself wasn't actually a Mahayana. He was sort of in between the Theravada schools and the Mahayana, kind of trying to make a bridge. He's very well respected. So after his death, they decided that Nagarjuna got the revealed teachings. And the Buddha in his wisdom did this so that the teachings would be prevented from slipping into decline, to revivify the doctrine. And they even explain, how did Nagarjuna go about getting these teachings? They say, well, the devas gave it to him, or perhaps Nagas gave it to Nagarjuna. Nagas lived in subterranean caves underwater. Because Nagas is a type of deva, the Buddha described, which is serpent-like the Loch Ness Monster, or here in British Columbia, we have the Ogopogo Monster in Okanagan Lake, which is true from Buddhist view. It's likely a Naga. So Nagas were known. So they said, well, the Nagas got it there, and there were subterranean caves underwater, and then they gave it to Nagarjuna. So that's where we have Tibetan Buddhism coming from today, and Zen, and Pure Land Buddhism in the Orient, and Mahayana school. So that's the official story. Now the Theravadins would say, well, it's certainly possible that the devas, even today, could channel down teachings that the Buddha gave them, because the Buddha did indeed, according to suttas, he would spend months in heaven teaching the devas. The Buddha taught his mother. She was a deva in Tushita heaven, and she kind of repaired down to Tawatim's heaven number 2. I won't show all the graphs, but she died a week after the Buddha was born, Siddhartha. So he was a really good son, and he spent 3 months, one of his early first or second retreat, rainy seasons, and he taught his mom and the millions of devas the Dhamma. This is true from a Theravada perspective. So the Mahayanas say, well, the Buddha had all these teachings channeled down from devas, so, well, the way we analyze this from a Theravada school, we don't just say, well, that's not true, that can't be possible. The Buddha stated, taking the Buddha's advice, he said, in the future, if people claim to be teaching my doctrine, you shouldn't immediately reject what they teach or accept it, but first you should carefully compare to the suttas and the Vinaya. So the suttas are discourses, and the Vinaya is like the rules of discipline for the monks, rules of ethics. And the Buddha said if it contradicts the suttas and the Vinaya, then you should reject it. But if it's in harmony with the suttas and the Vinaya, then you should accept it and follow it. So based upon this, the Theravadins decide the Mahayana is not the teachings of the Buddha. This is another doctrine. It's alien to the Buddha's teachings. And the Theravadins decided that the Mahayana contradicts the Buddha. It's not just something different, not just something added on to it, like a few extra techniques, but it's contradictory. So the Theravada elders, as well as the other 11 schools, they all decide to renounce the Mahayana. And their advice to you, their ancient advice, is that you should renounce the Mahayana. So that's your typical Theravada attitude today in Thailand, Burma, Sri Lanka. All monks are trained, they know about this. It's similar with the Catholics and the Protestants. Like the Catholics have a very thorough analysis of the Protestants, their views and what's wrong with it, and why the Catholics are better. And the Protestants, very thorough analysis, critique of the Catholics, and why the Protestants are better. And this is what scholars do. That's their job, especially if you're on one side or the other. So the Theravadins and the Mahayanas, for many centuries, they thoroughly analyze each other, and they can, analyze the deficiencies of the Mahayana. So that's the early history, and then things sort of branched out from there. Yes.
Brian, you said so there were 7 Thera schools.
Yeah.
But you said that
11.
Oh, 11.
Yeah, the 7 were the Mahasangikas.
Oh, okay. But I think you said that there wasn't much difference doctrinally between the Thera schools.
That's true.
So were the differences purely geographical, like in terms of them having, different names and only the 10?
Oh no, they split from each other. Often they would split over just tiny pieces of doctrine, over views, analysis, or over some pieces of dharma. Yeah. But often, the monks would often stay in each other's temples. Even Masagika monks would stay in Theravada temples. They got along pretty well. They functioned pretty well. They were that far apart. Yeah, so they still had the same teachings of the Buddha. But what really changed in terms of the Buddhist suttas was the Mahayana Sutras. So the word sutra, this is just running out of space here. So the Mahayanas have sutras, because the word from Sanskrit translates as sutras. The Pali we say, suttas. But what the Mahayanas did, in order to prop up the new doctrine, there's something different. And that's to kind of establish themselves. So they wrote about 10 to 15,000 pages of new and improved discourses of the Buddha, which are certainly regarded by scholars as a counterfeit. So this is problematical. Not only that, so if you read a Buddhist text, if it's Mahayana, you're quoting the Buddha, you can't really be sure the Buddha said that unless you cross-reference it with the Pali Suttas. So this is disconcerting. Like we have about 6,000 pages, right, of the Buddha's words in the Theravada Pali. Well, the Mahayana have about, depending on the size of the book, 10 to 15,000 pages of counterfeit discourse, like the Diamond Sutra, the Lotus Sutra, the Adamasaka Sutra, some of these famous sutras. Scholars really know that these are written from about 50 BC to 800 AD, so obviously it couldn't have been from the Buddha. But your average Mahayana student in an Asian country might not know that. In fact, many, many don't. They take it as the word of the Buddha. So that's problematical. In fact, the Buddha prophesied this in the counterfeit of the true Dhamma Sutta. There it is right there. The Buddha's words, he prophesies it in the future. This is what's going to happen. So I'll actually read for you the Buddha's words on this. It's really quite chilling if you really contemplate upon this. So here we go. This is the counterfeit of the true Dhamma Sutta in the connected discourses of the Buddha, which is the Samyutta Nikaya in Pali. This was translated by Bhikkhu Bodhi. It's the Buddha's chilling prophecy about the rise of the Mahayana, although he didn't use that name. So this sutta is found in chapter 5 of the connected discourses with Kassapa. Kassapa was the senior disciple of the Buddha at the time of the Buddha's death. So he was like the de facto leader at the time. So Mahakassapa asked the Buddha why there are more and more training rules, but fewer bhikkhus are established in final knowledge. So the Buddha said, so the Buddha saying this to Kassapa. He says, well, that's the way it is, Kassapa. When beings are deteriorating and the true Dhamma is disappearing, there are more training rules, but fewer bhikkhus are established in final knowledge. Kassapa, the true Dhamma does not disappear so long as the counterfeit of the true Dhamma has not arisen in the world. But when a counterfeit Dhamma arises in the world, then the true Dhamma disappears. Just as Kassapa, gold does not disappear so long as counterfeit gold has not arisen in the world. But when counterfeit gold arises, then true gold disappears. So the true Dhamma does not disappear so long as the counterfeit of the true Dhamma has not arisen in the world. But when a counterfeit of the true Dhamma arises in the world, then the true Dhamma disappears. So, he actually carries on a bit further. He says here, further down, he says, here are bhikkhus, bhikkhunis, these are nuns, lay male followers, female lay followers. When they dwell without reverence and deference towards a teacher, so he describes this is how things will deteriorate in the future. So he says it's not the earth element, Kassapa, that causes the true Dhamma to disappear, nor the water element, or the heat element, or the air element. It is the senseless people who arise right here who cause the true Dhamma to disappear. The true Dhamma does not disappear all at once in the way a ship sinks. So these are very good similes the Buddha gave us. No, Narakasapa, 5 detrimental things that lead to the decay and disappearance of the true Dhamma. What are the 5? Like I was saying before, here the bhikkhus, the bhikkhunis, and male lay followers, the female lay followers dwell without reverence and deference towards the teacher. Next, they dwell without reverence and deference towards the Dhamma. They dwell without reverence and deference towards the Sangha. So the Buddha, Dharma, Sangha, his teachings in the community. They dwell without reverence and deference towards the training. And they dwell without reverence and deference towards concentration, like meditation. So they're not following the training and they're not meditating. And then he says, Buddha says, these kasapa are the 5 detrimental things that lead to the decay and disappearance of the true Dhamma. What it means is that the Theras at that time, the Theravadins, felt that the rise of the Mahayana was the beginning of the end. Many would remark, wow, it's just like he prophesied, like 500 years after the Buddha. I think one of the commentaries said he said, I'm not sure if the Buddha said it'd be 500 years after his time. So they're saying, wow, the Buddha in his wisdom, he knew this was going to happen. And look, there's the Mahayana. It's happening. It's all falling apart now. This is the beginning and the end, just like he told us. So the Theravada attitude is one of sort of equanimity or balance or patience to this. So Theravadins tend not to engage so much with the Mahayana because before the Buddha's death, like just actually as he was dying, he said that the highest penalty is to ignore. So we don't have capital punishment in Buddhism. The highest penalty is to ignore. So generally the Theravadins just ignore the Mahayana.
How do you use that approach in your own life?
Huh?
How do you do that yourself? If you have a neighbor who's making a racket next door, do you just ignore it? Or how does it apply in a practical, you know what I mean?
Yeah, well, the Buddha, he was pronounced that particular in the sentence to Channa, one of the monks, was quite arrogant because he was with Prince Siddhartha when he fled the palace. He was like his charioteer. So Channa was a bit egotistical about his close association with the Buddha and his great arrogance. So the Buddha told Ananda to pronounce the highest penalty, to go to Channa and say, no, highest penalty has been pronounced by you, Channa. We're all going to ignore you. So it had the desired effect. He softened up, became humble, he improved, and he got enlightened. And they all lived happily ever after.
But in the example I'm using, if you don't tell your neighbor, then they just don't know there's a problem.
Well, you don't have to pronounce the highest penalty on your neighbor. You can actually go and talk to them or contact
They
them.
pronounced the highest penalty first.
So, but-
They didn't just ignore it. They said, we're going to ignore you from now on.
Yeah.
Giving them a heads up to
Yeah,
ignore. So you're at the bank and the teller is rude. Are you able to let water off the duck's back, or do you call people out? Or
Well, I think it always depends on the situation. Like maybe you can just let it go, or maybe you should speak to her manager. You might have to sort things out, say what is what, depending on the situation. Yeah, so I don't have to do another 2 hours of history. That was sort of the first 5 centuries. So this gives you an idea, at least so, about checking out authenticity. And you can always just Google Buddhist history. You get the dates of schisms. It's good to know.
So are you saying the sorry, I can't pronounce
Mahasangikas.
The Mahayana?
Mahasangikas, yeah.
Is that still practiced today now?
No. They've been extinct since about 1200 AD because a Muslim invasion from Turkey came in about 1197 AD and totally wiped out Buddhism completely from India.
I think, were you saying Mahayana or Mahasangika?
Yeah, I meant Mahayana.
Oh yeah, no, Mahayana is perhaps the majority of Buddhists in the world today. I'd say it's about 60% of the world is Mahayana today, 40% Theravada. But I'm concerned about you, what's going to happen to you after this course. In this city, it's probably about 70% Mahayana or 75% Mahayana, 25% Theravada. I'm one of the very few people in the entire city teaching Theravada Buddhism in English, other than the ethnic Theravadins. So Mahayana includes Tibetan, which is the dominant form of Buddhism in the West. Because of the diaspora, the Tibetan people in 1959, they learn how to speak English, went to India. And Zen is the second most popular. So it's a concern for you if you want to continue your Buddhist studies. That's why it's good for you to know. Of course, you got to make your own choice. I don't expect you actually to believe what I say. You should properly things cross-reference it. YouTube makes it easier. In Google, you can look up all kinds of stuff. Well, I think the problematic thing for the Mahayana is because they weren't around at the time of the Buddha, like Theravadins have no reference to the Mahayana in their scriptures, right? There's no reference except this prophecy. But unfortunately for the Mahayana, in order to be a higher wheel, or to be a big wheel, right, somebody's got to be a little wheel. So they use the term Theravada they use the term Hinayana for the Theravada. So Hinayana is a derogatory term. It's generally translated as lesser wheel, and they call themselves a higher wheel. However, that's the polite translation. The real translation, you can listen to Ajahn Brahm on YouTube videos. He says the term Hina means vile, disgusting, repulsive vehicle. So this is the Mahayana description of the Theravada. Of course, they'll say the term Hinayana came at that time. This was in northern India, right? And there's one particular school, not the Theravadins. We were in Sri Lanka. There's another school, and they're criticizing particularly just the Abhidharma aspect of that school, which is like a basket of scripture, and they called it the Hinayana. So they could argue, oh, we don't mean the Theravada, when we say Hinayana. But the way they use the term Hinayana includes today the whole of the Theravada. That's how it's used. Of course, some people are much more polite now. Even since the 1990s when I started, some Mayas getting more polite about the term. But what's important about their scriptures is built right into their scriptures. They criticize the Hinayana. And the basic criticism is that the Hinayanas are selfish because they don't want to get enlightened for themselves. They say the Mahayana, the emphasis is more on compassion. The Buddhis have a vow to help others. And the Theravadins are selfish. Because we have the Arahant ideal, which is the view and the goal of the Theravada is to follow the Eightfold Path and get enlightened, be an Arahant. Whereas the view and the goal in the Mahayana is a different view and a different goal. Their view is the Bodhisattva vow, which is the vow of compassion that you forego your own enlightenment in favor of the enlightenment of others, try to help others to enlightenment. And you take a vow that when you die, you'll keep coming back to help others to get enlightened. And keep doing this for almost forever until everyone's enlightened. And the goal is to do that. And they actually have a different nirvana than the Theravada. That's a bit confusing because in the Theravada teachings, nirvana transcends samsara. Samsara is cyclic existence. Nirvana is beyond and separate. But the Mahayana have a view which you can read a good essay by Bhikkhu Bodhi on this called Dhamma and Non-Duality. It's on my website at theravada.ca. He says the view of the Mahayana is outrageous from a Theravada perspective. Their view is that samsara and nirvana are inseparable. That nirvana is within samsara. Which is what I believed for many, many years, because I started off as a Mahayana. So I had to unlearn all this kind of stuff. So it goes on and on. So it's deliberately made to be obfuscated. So very few people will just give you the straight goods on what I just told you. Very, very hard. Maybe this will be the last time in your entire lives you'll ever hear anyone straight to your face tell you what I just said. Because, people want to be polite. Unless you have any questions, comments? I guess there's a lot to lay on, but I did a few as to inoculate you, to protect you, in case you miss the next week's class, to know a bit about history. Well, of course, it can be a downer if you get into it for too long. So I'm home now. I've got my tea. One thing I forgot to mention is Buddhist theory about Mahayana Buddhism. I got this the first time I met Ajahn Sona, actually in the year 2000. He was giving a talk on differences between Theravada and Mahayana Buddhism, largely to a group of Laotian, Thais, and other Theravadins. He said one of the root problems with the Mahayana is that they don't respect Arahants. It's all through their scriptures, basically, that they regard Arahants as selfish, they only want to get light for themselves, they don't have enough compassion for others, and so forth. I mean, this is what's in the Mahayana view. Maybe some schools of thought today don't have that view, but it's basically pervasive in the Mahayana. So he said, 2,000 years of not respecting arhats within the Mahayana resulted karmically in communism. And when he said this, the hair just rose on the back of my neck because I realized what he meant. He said that communism is a particular ideology where he says religion is the opium of the people. Karl Marx stated. Actually, I think his mentor Moses Hess actually wrote the Communist Manifesto. But it's an ideology that specifically picks on religion. And throughout 2,000 years of Buddhism in China, there's various kings and dynasties, and sometimes the Buddhist kings would persecute the Taoists, or a Taoist king would persecute the Buddhists. But none of these kings were like Chairman Mao. Chairman Mao destroyed, during the Cultural Revolution from 1966 to 1976, 500,000 Mahayana Buddhist temples. He wiped out 500,000 Mahayana Buddhist temples, drove the monks and nuns out, countless were killed. So this could be regarded as a karmic resultant of 2,000 years of not respecting arhats. If you don't believe in karma, or if you don't have a Buddhist view, you could explain it in human terms and say, well, Mao, this was his idea, the Cultural Revolution, and he picked on religion. That was just his decision. But from a karmic view, when big things happen like that, they're very likely, or almost always, some karmic resultant of individual karmas of a large group of people. So this could be seen in this way, because there's Mahayana Buddhism that was destroyed by communism, but not Theravada Buddhism. Theravada countries like Burma, Thailand, Sri Lanka were basically spared communism, except for Cambodia, which was attacked by Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger with the secret bombings of Cambodia, which destabilized the country and led to the rise of Pol Pot and communism. Other than that exception, Laos was communist and is also Theravada Buddhism. It wasn't harmed too bad. I mean, there's still Theravada Buddhism still survived there. So you have about 100 million people in the Theravada world spared the ravages of communism at the time, whereas communism engulfed not only China, but Mongolia, which was Buddhist, Russia, which was partly Buddhist, North Korea and Vietnam, all Mahayana countries where Mahayana was devastated by communism. So this reflection on karma, understanding of karma, gives you a deeper interpretation of a world events, another way of seeing things. Now, it's hard to prove that this is true. This is a theory. I can't say I know. I don't know. But it is a theory. It's something to consider. So we're not just talking about the differences between Theravada Buddhism and Mahayana Buddhism. We're talking about millions of dead people. And according to the law of karma, this could likely happen again in the future, but probably in some other form. So, next video. Now I'll talk about a disturbing theory which many Theravada monks believe. And that is the theory that Mara made Mahayana. I'll read some passages from my book, Freeing the Buddha. From page 380 to 392, I really lay the history bare. And this is red hot section of the book. So it begins on page 380 with this section right here. So it says, criticism is legitimate and necessary if we are to represent the teachings of the historical Buddha as he wished us to. The only hypothesis which explains the big picture of the whole Buddhist religion is that Mara made Mahayana. Mahayana. This is the final and ultimate truth about Mahayana Buddhism, according to this theory. The general theory of relativity in Buddhism. It cannot possibly be any worse than this. This is a terrible possibility to consider, but this issue is so important that our logic must be based upon perfectly valid reasoning. So, I'll read an account here from the Samidya sect. They claim that Mara was at the at the early schisms in Buddhism prior to the Mahayana. Now, Mara I should describe as, in Buddhist cosmology, he's a deva in the sixth heaven of the central sphere. In fact, I'll show you the illustration in my second book, A Short Walk on an Ancient Path, a Buddhist Exploration of Meditation, Karma, and Rebirth. So in the cosmology of the central sphere, on the sixth heaven, which is the highest heaven of the central sphere we have right here, you can see this is where the devas delight in the power of creation over others. And Mara lives on the outskirts of the sixth heaven of the central sphere. Mara is not the ruler. He doesn't rule over the heaven. He's on the outskirts. So his main function in Buddhist cosmology is to prevent people from getting enlightened, to trip them up, to tempt them with fame, money, power, sex, anything, to keep them plugged into the world of the senses. The Buddha had 16 personal encounters with Mara. So Mara is a personal being, a deva. There's other concepts of Mara, like Mara could be like greed, hatred, and delusion within you, the Maras. But Mara is a real being in the Buddhist view. So Buddhists are always on alert for Mara, who's up to his tricks again. So after the Buddha's passing, about 137 years after the Buddha, we have this account. I'll read this for you. Mara initiated the schism in the religion about 116, or by another account, 137 years after the Buddha, when Mahadeva turned against the Arhants. So the Samitiya tradition was one of the 18 early schools similar to the Theravada. In History of Religions, Natir and Prebish write this from 1976. They state, in the Samitiya account, the schism was provoked by Mara himself, who transforms himself into a man described as Bhadra, good, or possessing all good qualities. Taking on the robes of a monk, Mara teaches various supernormal powers, siddhi, and with his teaching of the 5 propositions, creates great dissension in the Buddhist community. As a result, the Sangha is divided into the sects of the Staviras and the Mahasangikas. This account adds some details not found in the Savastivardhan sources, supplying, for instance, the names of 2 monks, Naga and Theravada, who accepted and praised the 5 points. Even during the time of the Buddha, there were monks being influenced by Mara. So Mara is real, and Mara is, in this case, took on human form, wore the robes of a monk, and he was a charismatic leader, and he led this revolt against the monks with the 5 points. The monks were no good. So with that knowledge in place, with the rise of the Mahayana around 50 BC, it's not a great stretch for many Theravada monks to believe that, Mara's up to his old tricks again. Mara's created Mahayana. Look at the whole elaborate scope of the Mahayana. And we know it's the Mahayana Sutras, the discourses are counterfeit discourses of the Buddha. There's no scholarly debate about that. So to create 10 to 15,000 pages of false discourse of the Buddha, that could be attributed to Mara. I would say, personally, I don't know. I can't say with certainty. I can't actually say what I believe in the sense that I don't really know what to believe. I'm just weighing the evidence. But I certainly state it as a fact that it's possible that Mara made Mahayana. In December of the year 2000, I received this visual impression. I wouldn't call it a vision, but a strong visual image of 2 light bulbs. One's a clear light bulb, and one's frosted white. So the clear light bulb represents the Pali Suttas, the Theravada tradition. The filament represents the actual discourse of the Buddha and the light shining out clearly. Whereas the frosted light bulb represents the Mahayana, where the light is frosted, so it actually looks brighter in a way, it looks more attractive. But inside that frosted light bulb is a layer of black that you can't see, a thin layer of black. So this represents the sort of the force of Mara, the black side that you can't see, but it looks good, it looks bright. So after this realization with my light bulbs, I decided to seek a higher authority. I contacted a monk, get his views on it. This I'll just write from my book, page 383 of Bring the Buddha. So he wrote back to me and said, Brian, I have spent some years considering the Mahayana matter. I have many opinions about the historical motivations as well as the psychological motivations of the Mahayana school. Read the Katavatu of the Abhidhamma. These are concise and sometimes cryptic discussions of 500 points of controversy argued out between the Theravada and other schools, including the Mahayana. After that period, which could be as late as 300 AD, there is no formal reply to the various developments in the Mahayana and Pure Land sects from the Theravada school. As well, if you read the early history of Buddhism, passed down in Sri Lanka in the Mahavamsa and the Kulavamsa, you will see the clear reference to the Mahayana as fulfilling the prophecy by the Buddha that the sasana ends not by direct impression, but by counterfeit Dhamma. Their main motivations for many doctrinal developments were clearly competition with the Theravada, as they had to gather supporters after the schism at the Second Council. The 10 controversial points are absolutely bizarre and have had strange ramifications for the Mahayana ever since. This area of a critique of the Mahayana needs thorough research and careful strategy in order to make beneficial statements. Criticism is legitimate and necessary if we are to represent the teachings of the historical Buddha as he wishes to. So, there you have it. So, I once asked a monk, is it true that Mara made Mahayana? And he turned to me very calmly and said, many monks believe that. I even asked them, is it true that the Mahayana is evil? And he replied calmly, that's the mainstream Theravada view. So I should, at this point, say that Mahayana people are fine, and most of them are sincere in practicing what they want to practice, but I feel that they're being misled, and certainly Theravadins feel that they're being misled. So, food for thought.